Hello, I'm Stuart Winter, the platform architect and developer for Slackware on the ARM platform. In this installation guide, I'm going to walk you through installing Slackware onto the Pinebook Pro. Before we do that, I want to express my gratitude to the Pine64 company who have helped kickstart Slackware on the Uart64 platform by providing us generously with hardware. So thanks a lot for that. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to Brenton Earl for all of his help with the project. This project is made possible through your support. So if you like what we're doing here, please visit arm.slackware.com/sponsor. And thank you to all of you who have already sponsored the project, because your donations have helped pay for things like UPSs, hardware replacements and upgrades and that kind of thing to keep the project viable. So I really appreciate that support. Thank you. So let's begin by looking at the installation guide. To begin, head over to the arm.slackware.com website. Click on the installation link in the left-hand menu. Move down to Slackware 64-bit AArch64. Then click on the Pinebook Pro installation guide. The first thing to do here is to familiarise yourself with the whole page. So read through the documentation so that you know what's coming ahead, as it will help you during the installation. Once you've done that, review the hardware requirements to make sure that you have everything you need to proceed with the installation. Okay, now you've had a chance to familiarise yourself with the hardware installation guide, let me show you that hardware here. The first thing we need is the power supply for the Pinebook Pro, and this comes with the package. Next, you need a good quality micro SD card, as fast as you can get, which presently is a class 10 micro SD card. So you need a good quality one because this is going to be the operating system's boot partition, and you want a fast micro SD card because that will mean that the operating system boots faster, and when you upgrade the kernel packages and such, it will be a faster process. You need a minimum of 8 GB for this. The one that I have here is 64. Next, you need a USB flash drive. You need a minimum of 8 GB for that. This one is 32. This is just for the installation process. You don't need this once you've installed Slackware. Next, you need this, which is the Nvme Adapter. And you need the ribbon cable as well. You get these from the Pine64 company. You'll also need a screw and nut, retaining screw and nut, to screw the Nvme down. And these little screws come with the Nvme. These are to attach the Nvme to inside the Pinebook Pro. Next, you need the Nvme storage module. So this is where the operating system will reside, where it will be installed onto. Then we need a USB adapter. This is to copy the Slackware installer and the bootloader onto the micro SD card. So we just need that for the installation process. And we need a small crosshead or Phillips screwdriver to simply unscrew the base of the Pinebook Pro. The last thing I've got here is the USB to serial or Uart adapter. This connects into the 3.5-inch audio jack, headphone audio jack on the Pinebook Pro. Now this, I'm just showing you this because I have it. This is what I was using to develop the support for the Pinebook Pro. You do not need this to run Slackware, and you do not need this to install Slackware either. You can install Slackware over the serial port, but of course there's no need when it's a laptop and you can install it directly. So we won't be using that here, but just to show you, that's what it looks like, and that's where it connects. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is to turn over the Pinebook Pro and remove all of the screws from the base. All right, so I'm going to remove all of the screws from the Pinebook Pro. Okay. So just gently put your nail under there and just lift it off. It's very simple. There we go. Okay. Right. Okay, so I've removed the base. It's now time to configure it and install the NVMe. So the first thing that we're going to do is on here, this little switch here. This controls whether the Pinebook Pro can see or has access to the eMMC here. So this is a 64 gigabyte eMMC, which comes with the Pinebook Pro. So the Pinebook Pro ships with Manjaro Linux on it, which is stored in the eMMC. For Slackware, we don't use the eMMC. You can do if you want to. You can install it on there, although I'm not documenting that. So you can figure that one out if you want to do that. The reason why we're not installing Slackware onto the eMMC is because, in my experience from developing Slackware ARch64 on the Rock Pro 64, I was testing the eMMC and I burnt it out. So it's, for all intents and purposes, completely useless now. So I don't believe that installing an operating system on the eMMC that comes with this is not a good idea. Particularly if you're going to be installing Slackware Current and keeping up to date. So what I always suggest is that you leave Manjaro on here. That also gives you a sanity check, because if anything goes wrong, you can always reboot into that and test the hardware and make sure it all still works. So that's a really good sanity check, and that's also why I've left Manjaro on here myself. Now, what we do need to do though, because Manjaro ships on this eMMC, by default the eMMC is enabled, but we need to disable it. So to do that, we simply flick this little switch just there. In the installation guide, I suggest physically removing the eMMC to keep it safe, because we're not going to be using it. If you want to do that, you simply just get your nail and just put it underneath and just gently prise it off. It's really easy. I've kept my eMMC inside. Okay, to do that, you simply place the eMMC over the top and just push it back in and you'll hear that click. So I'm going to leave my eMMC in the Pinebook Pro because as long as it's disabled, it's out of reach of the Slackware operating system, so we can leave it safely there. Just make sure that the switch is in the disabled position there, which is down, the downwards position. So that's done. So the next thing that we need to do is to ensure that the sound is enabled rather than the serial. By default, the Pinebook Pro ships with this switch in this position, and this switch controls whether the 3.5-inch headphone jack that I showed you before is in serial mode or sound mode. Now, because this is a laptop, I think pretty much everybody will want to use the sound with a laptop. So I leave this in the downwards position to use sound. Unless you're developing on the Pinebook Pro or it has a problem and you want to debug it over the serial port, you should always leave it here. But again, if you want to use a serial port, just flick it into the upwards position. But we're going to leave it down so that we can use the sound. Now, this is vitally important. This yellow sticker here should be inside of your Pinebook Pro also, and you should read it. But essentially what it says is that you must, when you're running the Pinebook Pro, these wires here, I'll remove that so you can see, these wires here, this should be disconnected. If it's not, and you're running the Pinebook Pro, it will damage the battery or the board here. So these must always be disconnected. Some Pinebook Pros seem to ship with them connected, like mine did, but others don't. So again, just make sure that those are physically disconnected, otherwise you will damage the board. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is connect up the NVMe ribbon cable to the adapter here. So you can see the orientation, that plugs in that end and that plugs in that end. So this is really simple. The tracks side goes facing down and the shiny side goes facing up. There's a little flap here, just simply flick it up with your nail, take that, gently seat it on there, like that. You'll find that it homes quite easily actually, because obviously it's a perfect fit. So you just hold it, there's no pushing or anything, just hold it in and then fold over the plastic grip there. The next thing to do is to attach the NVMe storage module into the adapter. So you just take that, that's right, simply pop it in like that, like that. So it's home, push it down. Then we're going to attach the retaining screw and nut. Now, I have to say, I don't think that my Nvme adapter package came with this retaining nut. If it did, I lost it, so I found this one in my stash. If yours doesn't have one, then you do need to secure the NVMe module to the adapter base plate. Otherwise, it will come loose when you're using a laptop and it will damage the storage, or at least corrupt the file system. So let's attach that. Oh, I've done that the wrong way around. Let's attach that. So I put that like that. Okay, just hold that in like that. And just put the nut on the top. Get the screwdriver, hold it in like that. And just gently tighten it. Otherwise you'll push it down too far. So, ooh, I have actually. Okay, so just gently tighten it like that so that it's secure. Okay, the next thing to do is to connect this end, and as with the adapter end, you've got this little plastic flap, so just get your nail and flick it upwards. And again, just gently seat it, it's very easy. Okay, let me double check that actually. I think that's in properly. Just double check. Yeah. It's holding. Okay, that's that. And then finally, we take the screws. These ones definitely did come with the adapter, and just screw the retaining screws in to hold the adapter in place within the Pinebook Pro. Okay, and yes, it definitely helps sometimes to have a magnetic screwdriver, as long as you're very careful where you poke it. Okay, so that's it. Not much to it really, is there? We've installed the NVMe adapter, we've installed the NVMe into the adapter, we've connected the adapter with the cable, we've disabled Emmc, and we've enabled sound with the switches there. Okay, all that's left to do is to screw it back together again. Okay, so now we've done assembling the Pinebook Pro, it's time to move to the software and network environment setup. Now, in the documentation, I call it the Linux host computer. So for this video, I'm going to be using the Rock Pro 64 that I installed Slackware on for the installation guide. And you may note, if you've watched that video, that in the video, it was a bare board with a CPU fan. So its CPU fan has been removed and it's been placed into this Rock Pro 64 enclosure, where the enclosure itself acts as a heatsink. So it's really nice. It's a nice way of keeping these boards clean and safe from things falling on them and that kind of thing. Okay, so on this Rock Pro 64, I'm running KDE Plasma. So as you can see, it's very responsive. The first thing we're going to do is return to the documentation and to the software and network environment setup section. Within my home directory on my Linux host machine, I'm going to create a directory within the root of my home directory called Slackware and then change into it. So we'll simply take what it says here, cd into my home directory, make a directory called Slackware and change into that directory. We also want to record which directory it is, because we'll need this later when we use the root user to deploy the assets onto the microSD card and onto the USB flash drive. So let's take a look. Okay, so the directory we need to use when we switch to the root user is /home/moses/slackware. The next thing that we need to do is install the Slackwarearm Gpg Key. So we'll copy that, paste that into the shell, and hit enter. Okay, as you can see, that has imported correctly. Next, we select which version of Slackware we'd like to download. Paste that in. Then we choose which distribution server we'd like to use. But you may pick a mirror if you have one. I'm going to just take the one from the guide here. Okay, and paste that in. Next, we'll download the Bootware. So copy that, paste it in, press enter. Take the next one, copy that, paste it in. And now we'll download some more of the Bootware. We can simply copy both lines now and paste them both in and press enter, and it will download both of them. Now I'm going to download the verification tool. And now I'll download the Slackware Arch64 tree. The tree is approximately 5 GB in size, so this will take some time to download. Next, we're going to verify the assets that we've downloaded using the tool that we downloaded. But before we do that, we're going to verify the tool itself. So copy this line here and paste it into the shell. As you can see here, we're looking for good signature from Slackwarearm. If you find that the signature does not match, the first port of call is to re-download any of these assets and try again. If that still doesn't work, let us know on the forum and we'll have a look into it. Okay, so that worked. The next thing is we're going to verify the Slackware tree. So copy that text there and paste it into the shell. This will verify the Bootware assets and it will verify the full Slackware tree. This will take a few minutes to complete. The verification has completed. As you can see, there are 0 bad signatures. That's what we're looking for here. So everything is good. Next, we need to write the initialization bootware to the SD card. So the first thing that we need to do is elevate our privileges to the root user and then check which block devices are present. So let's do that now. SU, type in the root password. Type lsblk-d. We can see here which block devices are present. So now we'll insert the microSD card into the USB adapter and reconnect it to the Linux host machine and have a look again. So now I'll insert the microSD card into the USB adapter and connect it to the USB port of my Linux host computer. Now that the USB adapter with the microSD card is inserted into the Linux host machine, let's run lsblk-d again. Okay, so you can see the difference here. We now have an SDB and SDC. SDB is the microSD card. You can tell that because of the size. SDC is to do with the adapter itself, so we can ignore that one. So now it's time to write the initial bootware to the microSD card. We need now to change into the home directory into which we originally downloaded the assets. Because it's my home directory, there is a little trick you can use as a shortcut and just use the tilde. So I'm going to do cd-moses/slackware, but of course you could also type the full /home/moses/slackware path in as well. Okay, there are the assets in my home directory. First of all, we're going to just clear some space on the microSD card. Now, note that I'm going to prepend this with a hash now, because we are using the root user and I am pasting things in. So be very careful here. If you prefer, you may wish to paste this into a text file before you run it as root. I need to change SDC from the installation guide to SDB to match what I see on my machine here. Okay, so then we'll take that hash away and execute that command. Okay, so I've cleared some space. Now let's unpack the initial bootloader image and dump it onto the microSD card. So again, I'll prepend the line with a hash because I'm pasting it in, and put /dev/sdb and jump to the front of the line, delete the hash, double check it visually, SDB, yes it looks good, press enter. Okay, that's done. This should just take a second or so because it's a very small image. Next, we need to type in sync to synchronize the data to safely extract the microSD card from the Linux host computer. So that's now done. So now I can remove the microSD card and the adapter from my Linux host machine. So I'll do that now. Now that we've removed the microSD card from the host computer, we're going to do a quick sanity check. And this is because we're using root here to write to the block device. And so we need to be very careful to ensure that we only write to the device that we intend to. So we're going to run lsblk-d again, just to make sure that the block device names that we were using are no longer present on the system. And this gives us the confidence that when we write the Slackware installer to the microSD card in the subsequent steps, that we are going to be writing to the correct block device. As you can see, with the microSD card removed from the host computer, we can see that the list has reverted to how it was. So we're safe to proceed now. Okay, so we're all set to begin the installation process. Now that we've written the initial bootloader onto the microSD card, it's time to flash it onto the SPI flash. So first thing we're going to do is connect the power to the Pinebook Pro. I recommend that you keep it powered throughout the installation process. Okay, let's just plug that in. Okay, and hear the satisfying click as you position it in. When I initially received the Pinebook Pro, I couldn't get it to power on, and it's because the power socket wasn't entirely pushed in. So when you do that, make sure you put it in and you hear that nice click. Okay, so we take the microSD card with the initial bootloader on it and place it into the microSD card socket. Then to power on the Pinebook Pro, you just simply hold it for a couple of seconds, at which point the power LED will illuminate orange. Okay, so we're now going to deploy the initial version of the Slackware U-Boot bootloader into the Pinebook Pro's SPI flash. This takes about a minute. You have to wait 10 seconds initially, and you can ignore that message about the SPI jumper. That's simply because the Rock Pro 64 and the Pinebook Pro share this initial Bootware installation image. It's worth pointing out that this particular way of flashing the bootloader onto the SPI flash is a one-time event for the Pinebook Pro. If you want to do it in the future, you can use the Slackware installer to flash the latest version. Okay, so the process is now complete. So just hold the power button for several seconds and that will power off the Pinebook Pro. The power LED is now extinguished, so it's switched off. Okay, it's now time to write the Slackware installer image onto the microSD card. So let's now insert that back into the host computer. Now that we've reinserted the microSD card into the host computer, let's run lsblk again to see which block device it's been assigned this time. As we can see, the list has returned to how it was previously when we had the microSD card in to flash the initial version of the bootware. And again, we're going to be using SDB here. Still as root, we're going to now enter into my home directory, which is where we downloaded the Slackware assets into. So we've changed into the directory, and now we need to unpack the generic RK3399 Slackware installer image onto the block device that's been assigned to our microSD card, which in this case is /dev/sdb. It is not /dev/sdc. So this is an example of where you need to diverge from the installation guide. So let's do that. Again, I'm going to prefix this with a hash for safety. As I said before, you may wish to insert that into a text file for safety. Okay, so let's change that to /dev/sdb and hit jump to the line, remove the hash and press enter. This will take a few minutes to unpack because the resulting image is about 4 GB in size. And this is also one of the reasons why you should use a good quality and a fast micro SD card here, because it will improve the performance of booting the operating system, simply because the initial RAM disks are quite large. So the faster your micro SD card, the faster the system boots. The Slackware installer has now been written to the micro SD card, so we can type sync to ensure that all the data has been written to the micro SD card before we remove it from the host computer. So let's type in sync. Okay, that's done. We can now remove the micro SD card for the final time from the host computer. Okay, we're now ready to write the Slackware installation media onto the USB flash drive or USB stick. The first thing that we're going to do is yet again perform a sanity check. So let's run lsblk-d. And again, we can see that it's reverted to how it was before, now that the micro SD card has been removed from the host computer. So let's now insert the USB flash drive or USB stick into the host computer. Okay, now that we've inserted the USB flash drive or USB stick into the host computer, it's now time to write the Slackware installation media to the USB stick. So let's run lsblk-d again to see which block device has been assigned to the USB flash drive. As you can see, it's been assigned block device SDB, which, as you can see here, has a capacity of about 28 GB. The next thing to do is to create the ext4 or ext4 file system on the USB flash drive. Be very careful here to make sure that you select the correct block device, as shown in the installation guide. So let's copy that here. Again, for safety, I'm going to prefix the line with a hash. So I can paste that in. In this case, my host computer has detected my USB flash drive as SDB, so I can simply take it from the installation guide in this case. So hit enter there. This operation takes just a couple of moments to complete. The next step is to mount the USB flash drive somewhere on your file system. Slackware comes with a few different mount points within the /mnt directory. I'm going to pick one of the standard ones because on my host computer it's not already in use. For other Linux distributions, they probably don't have the same mount points as Slackware, so you'll have to mount it elsewhere. But for Slackware, we can do this. Just, of course, ensure that you're not already using this mount point on your Linux host computer. So I'm going to paste that in. Okay. And we can see here that it's now been mounted and the capacity is 29 GB. So we're now going to use Rsync to copy the Slackware tree onto the USB flash drive mounted under /mnt/hd. So let's do that now. Again, I'm going to prepend that with a hash for safety. Looks good to me. Hit enter. Now this is going to be transferring approximately 5 GB of content here. So it'll take several minutes to copy onto the USB flash drive. Okay, all of the Slackware tree has now been copied onto the USB flash drive. And so it's time to unmount it or umount it. And we'll also type in sync to synchronize the data so that we can safely extract the USB flash drive from the host computer. From this point on, we'll be using the Pinebook Pro exclusively, so we can close the root shell and stop using the Linux host computer. I'm now going to extract the USB flash drive from the host computer. Okay, so I've now written the Slackware installer onto the microSD card. It's time to boot the Slackware installer. So again, we put the microSD card into the Pinebook Pro's microSD slot, and we hold down the power button for a couple of seconds again, and it will power on. On the Pinebook Pro's LCD panel, the U-Boot bootloader is booting up and it's loading the configuration file called xlinux.conf from the microsd card. Into RAM, it's going to load the Slackware installer, which is the initRD ARM v8. Then it will load the Linux kernel, which is the image-ARM v8. You can see on the screen that it's appended a few kernel parameters. And then it's going to load the flattened device tree into RAM and finally boot the kernel. All right, so as you can see, the Slackware installer is now ready. Press enter. You're now presented with the option to select a non-US keyboard map. I have a UK keyboard on my Pinebook Pro, so I'm going to press 1 and select the UK map, then type in number 1 and press enter to accept that map. It's now time to create the partition table on the NVMe storage. So into the command prompt, you'll need to type fdisk space //nvme0n1 as shown on the screen, and then hit enter. The first thing that we're going to do is press O and hit enter. This will clear any existing partition tables so we can start from fresh. Next we type N, hit enter to create a new partition. For the partition type, press enter to create a primary partition. Press enter to select partition number 1. For the first sector, press enter. For the last sector, type plus, the plus sign, 4, then capital G for gigabytes, and press enter. Partition number 1 is going to be our Linux swap partition. So we need to change the type. So type in T and press enter. Type in 82, press enter. Press P to print the partition table. As you can see, the first partition is now of type Linux swap and it's 4 gigabytes in size. Next, we're going to create the second partition, which will house the operating system and everything else. So this is quite a simple setup that we're doing here. If you want to create more partitions at this point, you're welcome to do so. But we're going to keep it simple. So type N for new partition, press enter. Press enter to select the default of P for primary type. Press enter to accept the default of partition number 2. For the first sector, press enter. For the last sector, also press enter. Because I've used the NVMe storage before, I still have some residue, so it's giving me a warning there, as you can see in red on the screen. So just press yes to remove the signature. Okay, finally we're going to set partition number 2 to have the bootable flag. So press A, press enter, and press enter to select partition number 2. Now press P to print the partition table. As you can see, partition number 1 is Linux swap, partition number 2 is our Linux partition, and it has an asterisk in the boot column to indicate that it has the bootable flag set. And we've got the warning here saying that there was already a signature on partition 2 and it will be wiped. If your NVMe has come from the factory, it should be empty and you shouldn't have any of these warnings there. But as I said, because mine's been used before, there's still some residue on there. And that's okay. So we now press W to write the partition table to the NVMe storage. Press enter. And there we go. We'll finally type fdisk-L just to confirm. And there we go. So the partitioning is now complete. Okay, it's now time to load the Slackware setup menu. So type in setup into the command prompt and press enter. First thing is move to the add swap item on the menu and hit enter. Press enter here. Press no, we don't need to check for bad blocks. Press enter. And then again, we have a simple setup. We only have one partition. So press enter here. Yes, format it. And we'll use the ext4 file system type. If you'd like to use a different file system type, you can use any on the list that's presented there. All of them are fully supported. Formatting this NVMe just takes a minute. The next question is about resizing the boot partition on the microSD card. Unless you want to create any additional partitions on the microSD card that you'd like to use within the operating system, you can just say yes here, and that will resize the /boot partition to the full extent of the microSD card. In my case, as you can see on the screen, it's just about 60 gigabytes in size. And now the installer is configuring the bootloader. Press enter here. Okay, we're now at the source media selection screen. So it's time to insert the USB stick to which we copied the Slackware installation media into the USB-A port of the Pinebook Pro. So there we go, that's in there. Now that you've inserted the Slackware USB stick into the Pinebook Pro, you can move down to option 2 in the menu and hit enter. Now hit enter again. You're now presented with the package series selection. It's suggested that for Slackware you do a full installation because that takes care of all of the dependencies. However, if for example you know you're never going to use KDE or you're not going to use the Linux kernel source packages, you can deselect those as shown. However, we're going to install everything here. So I've reselected that and I'm going to select the terse option and press enter. And now you can see that the Slackware packages are installing. The installation takes just over half an hour. All of the packages have now installed and we're in the configuration phase of the installer. The first question is asking to configure the console settings. Unless you have the Pine64 USB to serial adapter that allows you to access the serial console of the Pinebook Pro, you should always say yes here. This configures the operating system to send all of the kernel and the operating system messages to the LCD panel of the Pinebook Pro. If you select no, it does allow you to use the serial port, but the operating system messages and the kernel messages will be split between those two output channels. So again, the recommendation here, if you only ever plan on using the Pinebook Pro without the serial adapter, is to say yes. So we're going to select yes here. At the start of this installation guide, we flashed the initial version of the bootloader into the SPI flash. You should now flash it again. This is because the initial version is typically older than the version that's included within the installer. So say yes here to flash the new version of the bootloader. This process takes approximately 2 minutes. We'll say yes here to delete the Slackware installer. If the installation hasn't gone well for you, you can reboot into the installer and go again. Mouse configuration, I'm just going to accept the defaults, so press enter. Yes, you want to load the GPM mouse driver at boot time, so press enter. This allows you to use the mouse within the Linux virtual consoles. Yes, I want to configure my network. I'm going to use the host name of Pinebook Pro, and I'll place that within the domain example.com. Choose no here for VLANs. I'll use Network Manager. Yes, it's all correct. These are the services to start when Slackware boots. you can leave the default selection as is, but I'm going to pick rc.rpc, which is the remote procedure calls, which are required to mount NFS file systems. Yes, we want to choose some custom screen fonts. Press T and then page down to the font TER-732B. Then hit enter. Press 1 to confirm it. I always pick no here and choose a local time. So press E in my case and then scroll down to Europe/London. You obviously pick whichever your local time zone is. I'm going to pick the default here for VI. I'll use KDE on the Pinebook Pro. Now type in your root password and confirm. OK, press enter. Now move down to exit the installer. Now you can physically disconnect the Slackware USB stick from the USB port. So do that now. OK, so I'll now unplug the USB flash drive. Now that you've removed the USB stick from the Pinebook Pro, you can press enter here. There are now 3 options: shell, reboot and power off. If you want to make any changes to the operating system configuration, or perhaps add any modules to the operating system initial RAM disk, you can pick shell and you'll find the operating system mounted within /MNT. You can use the OS initRD manager tool to make changes to the operating system initial RAM disk. For this setup, we don't need to do anything for the Pinebook Pro, so we're going to power off. Select power off and press enter. The installation of Slackware is now complete. So hold down the Pinebook Pro's power button for about 2 seconds. And once again, you'll see the output from the bootloader. Uboot will load the uboot configuration file, extlinux.conf, from the boot partition on the Microsd card. It will then load the operating system initial RAM disk, which is the initRD ARMv8, followed by the kernel, the image ARMv8, and the operating system will now boot. Okay, so the operating system has now booted and it's time to log in. So what we'll do initially is log in as root with the password we set in the installer, and then create ourselves a plebeian user, which you'll use to access the system. And then I'll load up X and show you KDE running on here. So type in add user, followed by the username, press enter, and you can press enter for all of the prompts here until you get to the name. So I'm going to type in my name, then press enter again, and then type in the password. Type it in again once more to confirm it, press enter, and then your new user account has been created. Okay, so I've added my plebeian user, my regular user account on there. I'll now switch to one of the other Linux virtual consoles with the Alt and arrow keys. Okay, so I'll log in now as my plebeian user. Type in startx and hit enter. Okay. All right, so KDE has loaded. Okay. Just to make it quick, I'm going to pick that option. So the wireless is connected, and let's see. So we're going to load Firefox now. All right, let's see. So as you can see, it's reasonably easy to assemble the Pinebook Pro and to install Slackware and get it up and running. So I hope you found this installation guide helpful, and if you have any questions, please ask on the Linux Questions forum and we'll help you out.